She slapped the resignation letter onto her boss's desk at 6:47 p.m., and he didn't even look up. "Leave it with HR," he said, phone to his ear, eyes on his monitor. Like she was furniture. Like 11 years meant nothing. Margaret Chen had done the same thing last month. Young, thin, presentable Margaret, who'd been hired 6 months ago and already had the corner office Amara had been promised twice. When Margaret quit, Director Holloway had stood at the elevator, personally carrying her box of belongings, saying, "We'll miss you so much." Amara's box sat by the fire exit. Nobody offered to carry it. She rode the elevator down alone. 34 floors. She counted every single one. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in November, punishing people for being outside. The rain wasn't falling so much as attacking, coming in sideways off the lake with the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. Amara pulled her coat tighter and realized, standing on Michigan Avenue with a cardboard box getting wet, that she had nowhere to be. Her apartment was 22 blocks north. Her umbrella was on her desk, her former desk. She had $43 in her checking account until Friday. She had a box of office supplies, a half-dead succulent named Gerald, and 11 years of her life that a man hadn't bothered to look up from his phone to acknowledge. She started walking. By the time she reached the Sapphire Lounge on Erie Street, she was soaking wet. Her left shoe was making a sound that could only be described as defeated, and Gerald had tipped sideways in the box and was leaking soil onto her personnel file. She didn't plan to go in. She wasn't a bar person. She didn't drink, not really. Maybe wine at Christmas, maybe a beer at someone else's cookout. But the sign above the door was lit in blue neon, and through the glass she could see warmth, and she had been cold for a very long time. She pushed the door open with her hip because her hands were full, stumbled slightly over the threshold, caught herself on a bar stool, apologized to it, actually said sorry to a bar stool, and made her way to the far end of the counter where there was an empty seat tucked against the wall. She set the box down. Wet coat on the back of the chair. Gerald propped upright against her purse. The bartender, young guy, maybe 25 with a jaw like a movie prop, looked at her, looked at the box, looked at Gerald. "Long day?" he said. 11 years, she said. He poured something amber into a glass without asking, slid it across. She looked at it. "What is this?" "Tequila. Don Julio. On me." "I don't really drink tequila." "You do tonight." She looked at the glass for a long moment. The clock above the bar read 2:13 a.m. She drank it. If you've ever sat in a bar alone at 2 in the morning and wondered how your life became something you didn't recognize, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if stories like this one find their way to your heart, please hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Amara's story travels. Subscribe if you haven't, because what happens next in this bar, what's already happening at table 7, is going to change everything. And you do not want to miss a single second of it. She had a second tequila. This one, she didn't question. The Sapphire Lounge was the kind of place that looked simple from the outside and revealed itself slowly. Good lighting, real leather on the booze, jazz coming from somewhere that wasn't a speaker. The crowd was mixed, suits loosening their ties, couples leaning into each other, a group of women in the back celebrating something loud. Normal. Human. The kind of scene Amara had been standing outside of for years, watching other people live inside it. She became aware, the way you sometimes do without knowing why, that someone was looking at her, not the casual glance in a way that happens in bars, something steadier. She didn't look up right away. She'd spent enough years being stared at work, in elevators, in meetings where she was the only black woman in the room, to know the difference between curiosity and assessment. This felt like assessment. Table 7 was positioned against the left wall, partially obscured by a decorative partition, which meant whoever sat there could see almost everything in the room without being particularly visible themselves. She knew this the way she knew floor plans, involuntarily, automatically. The part of her brain that had once been trained to read emergency room layouts in seconds, still cataloging exits and sightlines even when the rest of her had given up. She didn't look at table 7. She looked at the bottom of her glass instead. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from her mother. "Did you eat today?" She typed back, "Yes." She had not eaten today. She flagged the bartender for a menu and was studying it. She was going to get the fries. She needed to get the fries. The fries were $9 and she could make it work. When the commotion started at the far end of the bar, 3 men, late 20s, early 30s, the kind of loud that isn't just alcohol, it's intention. Loud to announce themselves, loud to take up space, loud to tell the room that they've decided to be in charge of it. The tallest one, in a red hoodie with a diamond stud in each ear, was standing too close to a woman at the bar who was trying very hard to signal with her entire body that she wanted him to stop standing so close. Amara watched. Most people in the bar were doing the studied performance of not watching, the Chicago social contract where you see everything and acknowledge nothing. Red Hoodie leaned in and said something. The woman shook her head. He said it again, louder this time, and his 2 friends laughed, and the woman picked up her drink and moved 3 seats down. He followed her. Amara's hand tightened on her menu. She told herself, "Not your business." She told herself, "You have $43 and a dead-end life and a wet succulent, and you are not capable of handling anything else tonight." She told herself all of the sensible things, and then she watched Red Hoodie put his hand on the woman's arm, and the woman said something sharp and clear and pulled away, and he got louder. And Amara got up. She did not think about it. The body moves before the mind sometimes. 11 years of sitting down, of being invisible, of staying in her lane while people walked across her, and something in her just didn't have the patience for it anymore. She picked up her glass, walked the length of the bar, and stepped directly between Red Hoodie and the woman. "Hey," she said. She said no. He turned around. He looked at her the way men like that look at women like her. The quick up and down that's meant to diminish. "And who the hell are you?" "Nobody," Amara said, which means I have nothing to lose. That was, she'd be the first to admit, not a well-considered statement, because Red Hoodie's expression shifted from dismissive to interested, and not in a good way. He stepped closer. His friends moved. The bar got quieter in that particular way bars get quiet when something is about to happen. "You need to walk away," he said, low and slow. "Right now." "I will," Amara said. "You first." Later, she would not be entirely sure what made her do what she did next. Her hands were shaking. She could feel it, the adrenaline shaking that she hadn't felt since residency, since the nights in the ER when they wheeled in something terrible and you had 2 minutes to decide the rest of someone's life. His hand was reaching for her arm. The angle was wrong, wrist extended, fingers splayed, elbow unlocked. She moved. One motion, palm strike to the radial nerve cluster just below the elbow joint. Precise, surgical, the kind of strike that doesn't look like much until the arm goes entirely limp. Red Hoodie yelped, grabbed his arm. His face went from aggressive to confused to furious. His 2 friends took a step forward, and Amara, still holding her tequila glass, said very quietly, "The nerve cluster I just hit takes about 4 minutes to recover. I know 3 more that don't recover as fast. Please choose carefully." She had no idea if they believed her. She barely believed herself. But they stopped moving. The woman beside her had already slipped away toward the back of the bar. Red Hoodie stood there holding his arm, staring at Amara with the specific expression of someone recalibrating what kind of night this was going to be. Then the bartender appeared, not the young one, an older man built like a door, and said something to Red Hoodie in a tone that left no room for conversation. The 3 of them left. The bar exhaled. Amara walked back to her stool, set her glass down, realized her legs were shaking. "You do that often?" the young bartender asked. "First time," she said, which was technically true in the way a lot of things were technically true. She picked up the menu again. The fries were still $9. Gerald was still leaning against her purse. The clock still read 2:13. No, wait, 2:19 now. She ordered the fries. She did not notice that the man at table 7 had not taken his eyes off her for the past 4 minutes. Kang Tae-hyun noticed everything. It was, professionally speaking, the reason he was still alive. He noticed the cut of every suit in the room and what it cost. He noticed the bartender's hesitation before he poured the second tequila, which meant someone had told him to be cautious tonight. He noticed the three men from the gang that ran the blocks between Wabash and Michigan, low-level, posturing, the kind of soldiers who'd be dead or in Stateville by 30. He noticed when they targeted the woman at the bar, and he was already calculating the least complicated resolution when the other woman stood up. He noticed her. He'd noticed her when she walked in, not because she was the type who demanded to be noticed, but because of the box. People who carry cardboard boxes into bars at 2 in the morning have usually had their lives interrupted that day. Interrupted lives make people unpredictable. He liked to track the unpredictable ones. She was a large woman. Natural hair damp from the rain, twisted back from her face. No jewelry except small gold studs. Coat that was functional rather than fashionable. The kind of person most rooms decided, without looking too closely, that they already understood. He'd watched the rooms be wrong about people like that his entire life. When she stepped between the drunk and the other woman, his chief of security, seated to his right, silent as architecture, had shifted slightly forward. Taehyun had put one hand on the table, a gesture so small it was essentially invisible, and the man had stilled. Wait. He watched her. The shaking hands that she didn't let into her voice, the precise calibration of the nerve strike. She'd aimed it. That wasn't instinct, that was training. The quiet threat that followed, specific enough to be credible, delivered in a tone that didn't perform confidence, just had it. Then she walked back to her bar stool and ordered French fries. Taehyun sat back in his chair. He was in the Sapphire tonight because of business. An arms shipment moving through the port at 4 a.m. needed his physical confirmation, a formality that the new pier authority required after the complications in September. He was here early, which was always his preference. Arrive early, leave late, see everything in between. He had not expected to find anything interesting. He picked up his drink, sparkling water always, on nights when he needed his mind at full capacity, and watched the woman with the cardboard box eat French fries alone at a bar at 2:21 in the morning, and he thought about the nerve strike, and the voice, and the shaking hands that never reached her face. Find out who she is, he said. His security chief, a man named Jun Seo, who had been with him for 9 years and never asked unnecessary questions, took out his phone. Amara didn't know the fries would be the best thing she ate that week. She ate them slowly, methodically, because she was hungry, and because eating slowly made them last longer, and because she had nowhere to be. The woman she'd intervened for had left without saying anything, which was fine. Amara hadn't done it for thanks. She'd done it because her body had simply refused, after 11 years, to stay seated one more time. Around her, the bar was thinning out. The celebrating women left in a loud, happy cascade of coats and phones. The couples unwound themselves from each other and found their cars. The suits became fewer. She was on her third glass of water. The bartender had quietly switched her over from tequila, which she appreciated, when she became aware again of table 7. Not because of movement, because of stillness. There's a particular quality to the stillness of someone who's trained themselves not to look like they're watching you while they're watching you. She'd seen it in ER waiting rooms. The family member who pretends to read a magazine while tracking every move the doctors make. She'd seen it in board meetings, in the way certain executives held themselves while someone else was presenting their work. She let her gaze drift naturally toward the partition and through the gap in it. A man. Korean, she thought. High cheekbones, dark eyes with that particular directness that made her want to look away immediately. He was dressed simply, but the simplicity was expensive in the way that requires knowing exactly what you're doing. Mid-40s, she guessed. A glass of something clear in front of him. A man to his right who she only now registered had been there the entire time. Because he'd been so perfectly still, she'd cataloged him as furniture. The man at table 7 wasn't looking at her in that moment. He was looking at his glass. But she'd felt it. 4 minutes of it. She looked back at her water. The ice had melted. Gerald had stabilized. She thought about the nerve strike and felt a little sick. She hadn't done anything like that since before. She'd spent 6 years telling herself that those reflexes had rusted over, that the person who could make those calculations was gone, along with the white coat and the OR privileges and the life she'd built over a decade and lost in a single ethics committee hearing. Apparently not entirely. She started putting on her coat. She was reaching for Gerald when someone set a glass of water in front of her, not from the bartender's direction. She followed the hand up. A man, mid-30s, Korean, with the kind of blank professional face that could mean anything. He was carrying something that wasn't quite a business card. Matte black, thicker stock, just a number. "Compliments of the gentleman at table 7, he said. "He'd like to speak with you." Amara looked at the card, looked at the man, looked toward the partition. Through the gap, the man at table 7 had finally turned to look directly at her. She felt it like a change in air pressure. "Tell him," she said slowly, "that I appreciate the water, but I'm going home." The man with the card didn't react. "He'd like to offer you a safer walk home. The street conditions tonight are fine," Amara said. "I walked here." "You encountered some difficulty." "I handled the difficulty." "Yes," the man said, and there was something that was not quite a smile in it. He noticed. Amara looked at the card one more time. She had a rule about men in bars who sent other men over with cards. The rule was no. The rule had been constructed over 37 years for very good reasons. She put Gerald under her arm, picked up her box, and walked toward the door. She made it 4 steps before her wet shoe, the defeated left one, caught the edge of a chair leg and she stumbled, caught herself on a table, knocked someone's empty glass, caught that before it fell, stood up straight, pushed the door open with her elbow, and stepped out into the rain. Behind her, through the closing door, she could have sworn she heard something from table 7. Not a laugh. Something quieter than that. She walked home in the rain. $43 in her account, Gerald in her arms. The matte black card had somehow ended up in her coat pocket. She didn't remember putting it there. She told herself she wouldn't look at it. She told herself a lot of things. 3 blocks from her apartment building, she stopped under an awning and turned the card over in her fingers. Just a phone number. No name, no company, nothing that would tell her anything. She put it back in her pocket and kept walking. Above her, Chicago kept doing what it always did, grinding forward, cold and indifferent, full of people deciding who they were going to be next. She didn't know. Standing there with her wet shoes and her dead-end life and a nerve strike, she told herself she'd forgotten, that the decision had already been made for her. She didn't know that the man at table 7 had watched her leave. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that by Thursday, she would. 3 days after the Sapphire Lounge, Amara still hadn't thrown away the card. It was in the kitchen drawer, under the takeout menus and the dead batteries she kept meaning to throw out and never did. She'd put it there Tuesday morning when she'd cleaned out her coat pockets, telling herself she was putting it somewhere she'd forget about it. She hadn't forgotten about it. She knew exactly where it was at every moment, the way you know where a bruise is even when you're not touching it. Wednesday, she updated her resume. Thursday, she called her mother back. Friday, she walked 12 blocks to the library because the Wi-Fi there was better than hers, and spent 4 hours on job boards applying for positions that paid 30% less than what she'd just left, which was itself 30% less than what she'd been making before. Before. That was how she divided time now. Before and after. Before was the OR, the residency, the years of building something she was good at, genuinely, objectively good at. The kind of good that doesn't need to announce itself because the outcomes speak. After was 11 years of sitting outside the things she'd built, watching other people practice medicine while she filed their paperwork and ordered their supplies, and made sure the refrigerator in the 3rd-floor break room got fixed before anyone important noticed it was broken. She had not missed the refrigerator. She had not missed Director Holloway. She had not missed a single thing about Meridian Health Group except the salary, which she now desperately needed. She got home from the library at 6 on Friday, made rice and canned black beans because it was the end of the month, sat down at her kitchen table and looked at the drawer. Didn't open it, just looked at it. Her phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. She answered it because she'd been applying to jobs and unknown numbers could be recruiters. Ms. Brooks? Not a question, not a greeting, just her name, in a voice that had clearly never wasted a syllable on pleasantry. She sat very still. Who is this? You didn't throw away the card. Something moved through her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling before a storm when the air pressure changes and your body knows something your brain is still processing. How do you know that? Because you answered. She opened her mouth, closed it, stood up from the table and walked to the window, which made no practical sense, but her body needed to move. That's not how phones work. If you'd thrown it away, he said, you'd have also deleted this number. You didn't. She looked out the window at the street. 7 floors down, normal Friday night. A couple arguing near the crosswalk, a delivery bike threading through the cars. A man in a dark coat standing very still on the opposite sidewalk, looking up at... She stepped back from the window. Are you having me watched? Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which had always been her particular talent and her particular curse. A pause. Not the pause of someone caught, but the pause of someone deciding how honest to be. I had your background checked. Standard. Standard, she repeated. Standard for who? For someone I intend to speak with again. She went back to the kitchen, opened the drawer, picked up the card. It was heavy, not like cardstock, like something with actual weight to it. Mr. She stopped. I don't know your name. Kang Tae-hyun. It meant nothing to her. Later, she'd understand what that said about the 6 years she'd spent with her head down in the administrative world of mid-level healthcare management, how completely she'd insulated herself from anything that wasn't directly in front of her. In that moment, the name was just a name. Mr. Kang Tae-hyun. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what you want, and in my experience, men who have people checked don't usually lead with the honest answer to that question. Another pause. When he spoke again, something had shifted fractionally in his voice, something she couldn't name. You performed a precise radial nerve block on a man twice your size without hesitation. Then you ate French fries. They were good fries. What were you before you became a secretary? The word before hit her like a flat hand. She sat down. Gerald was on the windowsill now, tilted again. She kept meaning to repot him and never did. That's not a conversation I'm having with someone I don't know. Have dinner with me. No. Tomorrow. I said no. Sunday then. She looked at the card in her hand. She thought about the library Wi-Fi and the job boards and the rice and canned beans and 11 years in the drawer she'd put this number in instead of the trash. Why? Because I haven't been curious about a person in a long time, he said. And I'd like to understand why I am now. It was, she'd give him that, the most honest thing she'd heard from a man in longer than she wanted to calculate, which was exactly why it scared her. Honest things from unfamiliar men at 2 a.m. almost always cost more than they were worth. Good night, Mr. Kang, she said. Don't call this number again. She hung up, set the card on the table, sat there for 11 minutes by the clock on the microwave. Then she put the card back in the drawer. She didn't know it was the last quiet night she was going to have for a long time. Saturday happened without incident, which in retrospect was the kind of calm that should have told her something. Sunday morning, she was at the kitchen table with coffee and a budget spreadsheet. She had enough savings for 4 months if she was careful, 3 if anything broke, when her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, knocked and wanted to talk about the building's heating situation, which apparently had been deteriorating since August. Amara let her in, made her tea, listened for 40 minutes, agreed that the management company was unresponsive, and helped her draft an email to the City Housing Authority. By the time Mrs. Okafor left, it was noon. She did not hear from Tae-hyun. She told herself she hadn't expected to. She'd been clear. She was good at being clear. She'd been clear 11 years ago when she testified before the ethics committee, precise and unambiguous, and they'd revoked her license anyway. So clarity was not, historically speaking, her protection against the world deciding to do what it wanted, regardless. She was at the library Monday afternoon when Jun-seo found her. She didn't know his name yet. She just saw him. Dark coat, the careful stillness she remembered from the bar. At a table 2 rows over from hers, not looking at her, reading something on a tablet. She might have convinced herself it was coincidence, except that she'd been here 3 days last week, and he hadn't been. And she'd specifically chosen this library because it was not the closest one to her apartment. She packed up her laptop, walked past him. "Tell your employer I said no." Junseo looked up. His face gave nothing. "I'm just here for the Wi-Fi." "The public library has better Wi-Fi than one of Taehyun's people can afford?" Something shifted in his expression. Almost nothing. A quarter degree of recalibration. "You looked him up." She had. Saturday night, after 2 hours of telling herself she wasn't going to, she'd found enough. Financial columns mentioning Kang Group as a legitimate import-export enterprise, a couple of charity galas photographed in the Tribune, the shape of something much larger and much darker visible at the edges of the search results if you knew how to look at what wasn't being said. She'd closed the browser and hadn't slept until 4. "Tell him," she said, "that I'm not interested in being a curiosity." She walked out. She was halfway down the front steps when her phone buzzed. Text from the unknown number. "That's not what I said you were." She stopped on the steps. Read it again. "That's not what I said you were." He'd said curious about her, not curious about what she was. It was a small distinction, and she hated that she'd noticed it. She typed back, "Stop texting this number." Then stood there in the cold and waited for a response that didn't come. She went home, made dinner, did not open the drawer. She was asleep by 10 and awake by 1, which had been her sleep pattern since long before Friday, her body apparently having decided that the hours between 1 and 4 belonged to it for processing things she didn't want to process in daylight. She was at her kitchen table with tea at 1:17 a.m. when she heard it, not through her window, from the hallway. Sounds that didn't belong to a building at 1 in the morning. Not neighbors, not pipes, something lower and more purposeful. She sat very still, the way she'd learned to in those first months after the license, when she'd lived in a worse neighborhood than this, and stillness was how you decided whether something needed to be acted on. Voices. At least 2. Moving past her floor, then stopping, then nothing. She stood up slowly, crossed to the door without turning on any additional lights, looked through the peephole, empty hallway. Just the ugly fluorescent light and the water stain on the ceiling outside 7C that had been there since she moved in. She stood there with her eye to the peephole for 90 seconds. Then her phone rang. She crossed the room to get it and answered without looking at the number. "Yes. Get away from your door." Taehyun's voice was different. No pauses now, stripped of everything except function. "Move to your interior hallway. Don't turn on lights. Do it now." "What?" "Now, Amara." She moved. The hallway of her apartment, the short L-shaped stretch between the kitchen and the bedroom, put 2 walls between her and the front door and the windows. She pressed her back against it, phone to her ear, heart doing something violent in her chest that she was methodically not letting into her voice. "What is happening?" "Evelyn's people made you faster than I expected." He said it like it was a logistical problem, which she understood was how someone stays functional in a crisis, but which also made her want to throw the phone across the room. "There are 2 men in your building. They came in through the service entrance." "How do you know?" "I have someone outside. He saw them." "You have someone outside my building at 1 in the morning." "Yes." "Without telling me." "Would you have allowed it?" She pressed her back harder against the wall. In the distance, or not very far at all, it was hard to tell, she heard the stairwell door open. Her floor. "No," she said. "Who is Evelyn?" "A problem I should have resolved 6 months ago. I'll explain everything when—" He stopped. She heard something through the phone that might have been voices. When he came back, his voice was half a degree tighter. "My man outside is compromised. I need you to listen carefully." "I'm listening." "Your building has a basement maintenance corridor that connects to the utility tunnel under Erie. I know this because I had the building plans pulled on Saturday." A pause that was exactly long enough for her to register what that meant, and too short for her to say anything about it. "Access is through a panel behind the laundry room on B1. Press the release on the upper left corner." "That's—" She stopped herself. Calculated. The basement was accessible from her floor via the back stairwell, which was on the other side of her apartment from where she'd heard the stairwell door. "That's 8 seconds of exposure in the hallway to reach the back stairs." "Can you do 8 seconds?" She thought about it clinically. 2 men, Service entrance, building with 3 exits she could account for. The specific sound of footsteps in the main stairwell, which suggested they were moving up, not down. Yes. What's at the end of the tunnel? I'll be there. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that this was an enormous amount of trust to place in a man she'd spoken to twice and hadn't met. She thought it, though. She sat with it for exactly the time she had to sit with it, which was about 3 seconds. My neighbor in 7F. Older woman. She can't move fast. My people will get her out through the front after you're clear. You promise me that. I promise you that. She grabbed her coat off the hook, pushed her feet into her shoes, both of them, including the left one, which she'd glued the sole back down on Thursday, more from stubbornness than optimism. Keys in pocket, phone in hand. She looked once at the kitchen table, at the budget spreadsheet, and the cold tea, and the ordinary debris of the life she'd been trying to preserve, and then she stopped looking at it. Going now, she said. She opened her apartment door. 8 seconds in the hallway felt like a geography lesson she was taking at gunpoint. She moved fast and low, not running. Running made noise, but the quick, purposeful stride she'd learned in trauma bays where you needed speed without the sound of urgency that made patients panic. Past 7B, 7C, the water stain. The back stairwell door was steel, which meant it was going to be loud. She pushed it open in one motion and was down the first flight before it swung shut behind her. Below her, nothing. Above her, a door opened. She did not stop, did not look up. B1 in 12 more seconds. 10, 8. The door at the bottom was unlocked. Laundry room, industrial washers lined up in the dark like sleeping animals. She found the maintenance panel by feel, upper left corner, pressed until she felt the magnetic latch give, and the panel swung out into black. She went in. The tunnel smelled like concrete and old water. The phone screen gave her 3 feet of visibility. She moved and counted steps because counting was something her brain could do while the rest of her ran on something older and more animal. At 60 steps, she saw light. Not much, a thin seam of it, and then it expanded and Tae-hyun was there. She'd been building a version of him in her head from fragments. The bar, the phone calls, the things she'd found in the search results. And the reality of him at close range, in a tunnel at 1 a.m. with a gun visible in his right hand, was sharper and less manageable than any version she'd constructed. He was taller than she'd registered from across the bar. The cold expression she'd seen through the partition was still there, but underneath it something was moving fast. His eyes doing the same rapid assessment he'd probably been doing since before she got in the tunnel. "You're not hurt," he said. "No." "Good." He put the gun away. Not holstered, just inside his jacket, which was a distinction she noted and filed. "We need to move. My car is—" "Who is Evelyn?" Amara said. "And why are her people in my building?" He looked at her for a moment. Around them the tunnel hummed and dripped. "I'll tell you everything." "Tell me now." "I'm not moving until I understand why I just left my apartment in the middle of the night." His jaw tightened. "Evelyn O'Connor runs the Irish syndicate on the north side. She and I have been in a territorial dispute for 8 months. 3 days ago, she ambushed my convoy on the expressway. 2 of my men are dead." He said it flatly, the flatness of someone who is not feeling it. "She believes the best way to pressure me is through people I've expressed interest in." The tunnel was cold. Amara felt it for the first time, really felt it, working through her coat. "You expressed interest in me 4 days ago. She moved on me in 4 days." "She's efficient." "How did she know you called me?" Silence. And in the silence, understanding arrived in Amara the way a diagnosis arrives. Not suddenly, but assembled, piece clicking into place after piece. "You have a leak," she said. "Someone inside your organization told her." He didn't answer, which was an answer. "So I'm being targeted because someone who works for you sold me out to your enemy." "Yes." "And your solution is to put me in a car and take me where?" "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you control." "Yes." She breathed out through her nose. Above them somewhere, in a building she'd lived in for 6 years, men had come for her because she'd performed a nerve strike in a bar and hadn't thrown away a card, because she'd answered a phone call, Because she'd made a series of small decisions that had seemed, each of them individually, like nothing. My neighbor, she said, Mrs. Okafor in 7F. Junseo is already, I want confirmation. He took out his phone, said 3 words into it in Korean, listened, said something else, looked at her. She's out. She thinks there's a gas leak. She's with a building official. A pause. Junseo is very convincing as a building official. Amara looked at him for a long moment. His face in the thin light was giving her almost nothing. The control was extraordinary, the kind you build deliberately over years until it becomes structural. But there was something at the edge of it, not guilt exactly. Something that had been living next to guilt for long enough that it had taken on a similar shape. If I get in your car, she said, I want the truth. All of it. Not the version that keeps me calm. That's what I'll give you. I've heard that before. I know. He looked at her with that directness that had hit her like air pressure change in the bar. I know you have. She didn't ask how he knew that. She'd asked enough questions in dark tunnels for one night. She followed him. The car was black, unmarked, with 2 men in the front she didn't look at directly. Taehyun sat beside her in the back with 12 inches of space between them that felt more like a negotiated border than a casual distance. They didn't speak for the first 4 minutes. Chicago moved past the tinted windows. The night shift city, the version most people didn't know. Delivery trucks, hospital workers, the infrastructure of a place maintaining itself while its inhabitants slept. You pulled my building plans on Saturday, Amara said. Yes. You've been planning for this contingency since Saturday. I've been planning for every contingency, including the one where someone in your organization told Evelyn about me. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the expressway opened up, and the car accelerated. I didn't know about the leak on Saturday. I suspected it by Sunday. I confirmed it tonight, 30 minutes before I called you. 30 minutes. She absorbed that. What did you do with the person? The silence that followed had a particular texture. They're no longer a concern. She didn't press it. She understood what it meant, and she also understood that she was sitting in a car with a man who operated by rules that were not the rules she'd organized her life around, and that understanding this clearly was more useful than pretending otherwise. Where are we going? I have a property in Lincoln Park. Secure, private, not connected to any of my known holdings. He paused. It's not a prison. You can leave whenever you want. Can I? You can. The flatness again, the same tone as when he'd told her his men were dead, which she was beginning to understand was how he spoke when he meant something completely and didn't want to perform the meaning. That's not how I do things. She looked out the window. She thought about the word safe and what it cost and who got to offer it and under what terms and what you became on the other side of accepting it. She thought about the tunnel, about counting steps in the dark, about a nerve strike she'd told herself she'd forgotten 6 years ago when she'd packed the white coat in a box and put it under her bed where she didn't have to see it. Who else knows about this property? She asked. 3 people. And your leak? Is no longer a problem. You said that. She turned to look at him directly, the 12 inches between them, the window behind him and the Chicago skyline moving past, and the gun still inside his jacket. How do you know there's only one? He looked at her, and she watched something happen in his face that she suspected didn't happen there often. A real pause, not the calculated kind, but the kind where a thought arrives that hadn't been there before. I don't, he said, not with certainty. Then we might be driving toward another one. He didn't answer. I want a map, she said, of the property, every entrance, every exit, service accesses, utility connections. I want to know the layout before we arrive. He looked at her for another moment with that same quality of recalibration she'd seen in Junseo's face at the library, like he was adjusting the model he'd built of her in real time. He took out his phone, pulled up a file, handed it to her. She took it, started studying. She didn't know yet what was waiting for her at the other end of that drive. She didn't know that safe houses weren't safe, that leaks ran deeper than either of them had calculated, that by morning the city would be burning in ways that had her name written somewhere in the cause. She didn't know any of that. She knew the map. She memorized it in 4 minutes because she'd always been good at reading spaces, at understanding how a building breathed, at finding the seams in things that looked seamless. 4 minutes, and she knew every way out. She was going to need all of them. The property in Lincoln Park was a townhouse on a dead-end street that didn't appear on any real estate listing Amara would ever find. She knew this the moment they pulled into the alley behind it. The way the street had been closed off at one end with a barrier that looked municipal but wasn't. The way the neighboring building sat dark and unoccupied with the particular stillness of places that had been emptied deliberately rather than abandoned naturally. Someone had spent considerable resources making this block invisible, and the resources had worked. Inside was clean, warm, and deeply impersonal, the kind of space that existed for function rather than habitation. Good furniture, nothing decorative, 3 separate deadbolts on the front door, a kitchen stocked with things that didn't expire. She walked through it the way she'd memorized the map, matching the floor plan in her head to the physical reality, checking the margins where maps were always wrong, a window that opened differently than the blueprint suggested, a second staircase behind a door marked as a closet. She filed every discrepancy without commenting on it. Tae-hyun watched her walk the perimeter. He didn't interfere, didn't explain, didn't tell her she was safe now, the way people told you things that were meant to make you stop thinking. She appreciated that more than she had language for. Junso arrived 20 minutes after them, face unreadable, with a bag she recognized as coming from her apartment, her laptop, her medication, the charger she'd left on the kitchen counter. She looked at it. "You went in after I left." "Before they reached your floor," Junseo said. "How close was it?" He set the bag down on the table. Didn't answer, which was an answer. She unzipped the bag, found Gerald wrapped in a dish towel at the bottom, slightly traumatized but intact. She set him on the windowsill without saying anything and heard, very distinctly, what might have been a sound from Tae-hyun's direction. Not quite a sound, the suppression of one. "Sit down," she said. Not to Junseo, to Tae-hyun. "You're going to tell me everything now, all of it. Start from why Evelyn O'Connor wants you specifically dead, and don't skip the parts that make you look bad." Junseo excused himself with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd learned when to be somewhere else. Tae-hyun sat. He talked for an hour and 20 minutes. She sat across the kitchen table from him with a glass of water she didn't drink and listened in the way she'd learned to listen in diagnosis. Not just to what was said, but to what was organized around, the shapes of the gaps. He talked about the territorial structure of Chicago's criminal infrastructure with the same tone someone else might use for urban planning, which she supposed was accurate. He talked about the agreement that had held the North Side and the corridor around the port for 11 years, the careful balance that Evelyn had inherited from her father and decided 8 months ago to stop honoring. He talked about the convoy ambush. He'd been in the second vehicle, not the first, which was why he was alive. The first vehicle had been hit with something that left no survivors and very little vehicle. He talked about the 2 men who were dead, called them by their first names. Young-soo, who had a daughter in Evanston who thought her father was a logistics manager. Minho, who had just turned 32 and had been trying to get out for a year, but hadn't figured out how yet. He said their names once each and didn't return to them, but they stayed in the room. "The leak," Amara said. "Who was it?" He looked at the table. "A man who'd been with me for 6 years. I trusted him more than I should have trusted anyone." A pause. "He thought Evelyn was going to win. He was making arrangements." "What did you do with him?" "What I had to do." He looked up. Direct, as always. She was getting used to the directness, the way he didn't soften things or arrange them for easier reception. "I'm not going to tell you it was something other than what it was." She absorbed that. Outside, Chicago was beginning its pre-dawn version of itself, the first garbage trucks making their rounds. She thought about the ethics committee and the things they'd called unforgivable, which were nothing like this and were still the thing that had broken her life in half. "How many people know I'm here?" she said. 3, including Junseo. "Your organization is how large?" "Operationally, about 60 people. And one of them just sold you to Evelyn." Was. So, 59 now, and you're certain there's only one." He was quiet. "You're not certain," she said. "I'm 90% certain. That's not a number that helps me sleep." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She stood up, walked to the window, not the street-facing one, the one at the side that looked into the narrow space between buildings, just brick and shadow, and a fire escape. Gerald sat on the sill. She picked him up. The soil was dry. She hadn't watered him since Tuesday. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About me. Because you had my background checked and you found the administrative record, and I want to tell you what's not in the administrative record. You don't owe me I know I don't owe you. I'm choosing to." She turned around, set Gerald back down. "I lost my medical license 6 years ago. The committee's reason, officially, was procedural violations during a complex surgery. The real reason was that a hospital administrator needed someone to be responsible for a patient outcome that was the result of a systemic failure, and I was convenient and I refused to sign a statement saying otherwise." He was listening with his whole body, the way he did, very still, no performance of listening, just actual attention. "The patient survived," she said. "That's what they never mention in the filing. She survived because I made the decision they called a violation. She has 2 kids in Naperville and she coaches soccer on Saturdays." She paused. "I looked her up once. I needed to know it mattered." "It mattered?" "It mattered to her, not to the committee." She leaned against the wall. The exhaustion was arriving now, the kind that waits until you're somewhere your body decides might be survivable and then lands on you all at once. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I'm someone who made a choice that cost me everything, and I'd make it again. Which means I'm not easy to manage. I don't take well to being arranged." "I understand that." "Do you?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm not trying to manage you. I'm trying to keep you alive. There's a thin line between those two things from where I'm standing." "I know." He said it without flinching, which she was learning was his version of acknowledgement. "I know there is." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen in the blue pre-dawn light, the gun inside his jacket, the names of the dead men still in the room with them. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll take the first few hours. I don't sleep well anyway." "Amara? I'll wake you at 6. We can figure out the rest then." He stood. He was closer than she'd registered. She'd been focused on the conversation and not the geometry, and now he was 3 feet away and the distance required a specific kind of management. He was looking at her with something that wasn't quite the controlled assessment from the bar, something that hadn't been organized as carefully. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving in the tunnel." "I nearly did." "I know." Almost nothing in his expression. Almost. "That's what I'm thanking you for." He went upstairs. She sat in the kitchen with the silence and Gerald and the dry soil, and the fact that somewhere in the city, Evelyn O'Connor knew she existed. She was not afraid yet. She understood that the fear was coming, that it was the logical response to everything that had happened in the last 4 hours. But her mind kept sliding past it into the thing she was better at, the analytical space, the part that mapped the available information onto the available options and ran the calculations. She was running them when the first light came up. She was still running them when Tae-hyun came back downstairs at 5:40, which told her he was also someone who didn't sleep well. They made coffee without discussing the fact that neither of them had slept. The morning was almost normal. She borrowed his laptop, updated 3 more job applications because the world outside the situation still existed and she was going to need to live in it eventually. He sat across from her and answered a steady stream of calls in Korean, his voice clipped and functional, and she didn't try to follow it except for the frequency and tempo, which told her things were moving and not slowly. Junseo came and went, brought food at 9. Actual food, not just supplies, from somewhere that had clearly cooked it that morning. She ate and didn't ask where it was from. Around 11, Tae-hyun came to the table and sat down with an expression that had changed by a degree she was beginning to be able to read. "Evelyn reached out," he said. "To you directly?" "Through a channel she knows I monitor." He put his phone face up on the table between them. "She wants to meet. Says she has a proposal." Amara looked at the phone. It's a trap. Obviously. Then why are you showing it to me? Because I want to know what you think the trap is. He leaned back. You mapped Evelyn without knowing her, at the bar, in the building. You read the situation correctly before I had confirmation. I want your read on this. She looked at the message on the screen. Minimal, almost elegant in its brevity. A location, a time, a single sentence. Come alone or don't come. This ends either way. She's not proposing a meeting, Amara said slowly. She's making a declaration. Go on. She said, this ends either way. That's not negotiating language. That's someone who already knows the outcome they want and is giving you the formality of a decision point. She tapped the edge of the table. A habit, her thinking gesture. She'd done it through every diagnosis she'd ever worked. She's also pressuring you to come alone, which means she understands your advantage is structural. Your people, your network. She wants to strip that, which means she doesn't yet have the resource to overcome it directly. She has mercenaries, at least 30 I've confirmed. Numbers don't replace structure. She knows that too. Amara looked up. Where's the location? A restaurant in Bridgeport. Neutral, historically, public enough to complicate a direct action. Except for you, specifically, public doesn't complicate it. She paused. What's happened to her businesses in the last week? Not the front operations, the real ones. He studied her. 2 of her distribution points have been disrupted. 1 completely. By you? In response to Youngsu and Minho. So she's bleeding operationally. She called this meeting because she needs it to, not because she's winning. Amara sat back. The calculation was arriving fully now, assembling itself with the cold clarity that she'd once used to decide surgical approaches and had apparently never stopped being capable of. Don't go to the meeting. Don't respond to it at all. Make her wait. If I don't respond, she escalates, and when she escalates under pressure, she makes mistakes. She held his gaze. You've been fighting her on her terms since the ambush. Reactive, defensive. Let her make the next move from a position of anxiety. She gave you a time limit. She glanced at the phone. 6 hours. That's a tight window from someone who's more desperate than she's letting on. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him testing the logic, running it against whatever framework he used. All right, he said. Don't respond at all. I won't. She nodded. Went back to the job applications. He went back to his calls. 4 hours later, Evelyn's next move arrived. It arrived as a phone call to Junseo from a number that shouldn't have had Junseo's number, which was the first problem. The second problem was what it said. Junseo appeared in the kitchen doorway. He didn't look alarmed. Amara was learning that Junseo expressed alarm through a specific quality of stillness, an extra degree of control, like a valve closing. He was very still right now. She burned the Wicker Park property, he said. 20 minutes ago. Taehyun stood up. Anyone inside? 3 people. They're out. Minor injuries. Junseo paused. She also called the fire in. The building is currently surrounded by city fire response, which meant police, which meant Taehyun's name, attached to a burning building, in a city where his legitimate holdings were carefully maintained and his less legitimate ones were completely invisible. Insurance on the property? Clean, but there will be an investigation. Amara watched this exchange with her hands flat on the table, processing. Evelyn hadn't gone for a body count. She'd gone for visibility. She'd wanted Taehyun's name in the incident report. She was using the city's own administrative systems as a weapon. She's clever, Amara said, not entirely meaning to say it aloud. Taehyun looked at her. Yes. She's not just a crime boss. Amara stopped, tapped the table. What did she do before she took over the syndicate from her father? Law, he said. University of Chicago. She practiced for 4 years. She's not thinking like a criminal. She's thinking like someone who understands how institutions respond to pressure. Amara's mind was moving fast now, pieces connecting that she hadn't known she was holding. The fire with the call-in. That's not just destruction, it's bureaucratic judo. She knows how a city investigation works. She knows where the pressure lands. She looked at Taehyun. She's building a case against you that uses the city as the instrument, not just coming at you with guns. She wants you removed by the system. The room was quiet. She can't succeed with that, Junseo said. The properties are… She doesn't need to succeed. She needs to occupy you. Amar's voice was sharper now, the urgency coming through despite herself. While you're managing city investigations and insurance inquiries and protecting your legitimate holdings, your operational attention is divided. She moves on the port access while you're handling the paperwork. She looked at Tae-hyun. The arms shipment, the one that was coming through the port. Has it cleared? The silence that followed was 3 seconds long and very loud. It hasn't, Tae-hyun said slowly. Where is it? Holding offshore. There were complications with the pier authority. Complications she created. He stood absolutely still. She watched him assemble the same picture she'd just assembled, piece by piece, and she watched the expression on his face go through something that wasn't quite any one emotion. Recognition and fury and something that looked like the specific humiliation of someone who's been outmaneuvered. The pier official, he said. She got to him. I need to make a call. He was already moving, phone out. What happened next happened fast in the way that very bad things happen. All at once. From multiple directions, the way a diagnosis you've been missing suddenly becomes obvious only because the patient has stopped responding. Junseo's phone went off simultaneously with a sharp sound from the front of the building. Not a knock, not a car, something that hit the exterior wall and left a sound frequency she knew from exactly one context. She'd been in the ER when a shooting victim came in and described the sound of the shot. Suppressed. High caliber. And it had hit the wall 3 feet from the kitchen window. Down! Tae-hyun's voice hit a register she hadn't heard from him. Not loud, the opposite of loud. The kind of command that didn't need volume because it had already decided it would be obeyed. She was already moving. The floor, lateral toward the interior hallway, the same instinct as the apartment, but faster now because there'd been a rehearsal. Another impact, this one closer, and the kitchen window came apart above her as she crossed beneath it, glass coming down like something was exhaling. She made the hallway. Tae-hyun was behind her, gun out now, and not inside the jacket. Junseo was on his phone in Korean, voice tight, clipped, relaying something she couldn't follow. How many exits has she covered? Amara said. Not a question, a calculation said aloud. Working on it. Junseo listened, said something. Front an alley. She has the alley. The utility access in the basement. Checking. Another impact. This one was in the front room, and she heard something. Not glass this time, something structural. They were hitting the building itself. She's not trying to kill you, Amara said. She could feel her own pulse in her throat, but her voice was doing the thing it always did. The thing 11 years of trying to kill it had not managed to kill. She's trying to move you. She wants you in the street. Why? Tae-hyun said. Because someone's waiting in the street. Junseo looked up from the phone. Even in that moment, even through the controlled stillness, she saw it. The specific quality of a man receiving confirmation of something he'd been dreading. Hyun, he said, using just the name, just the 2 syllables, and something in Tae-hyun's face changed. How many? Tae-hyun said. The count is 12. Armed. Street coverage, east and west. Amara did the math without wanting to. They were in a building with suppressed fire from 2 directions, 12 men in the street, the alley covered. The utility access was the only unmapped exit, unmapped by Evelyn, she had to hope, because it wasn't in the public building plans, only in the private ones Tae-hyun had pulled. But Evelyn was a lawyer who thought in systems. A lawyer who thought in systems would pull private building plans. The utility access, she said. When you pulled the building plans, where did you pull them from? City records, Tae-hyun said. She felt it before she finished the thought. The same way she'd felt the diagnosis assembling. Then she has them too. The word two sat in the hallway between the 3 of them. In the wall 6 inches above Amara's head, something hit the plaster and didn't go through. She pressed against the floor. Tae-hyun was completely controlled, gun up, eyes on the end of the hallway, but she could see the edges of his jaw working. The thing that happened when someone was thinking very hard and very fast and not letting it show in their voice. There's a third option, she said. Tell me. We don't go down. We go up. He looked at her. The roof. She was already mapping it, the floor plan from memory, the structure of the building, the Lincoln Park Townhouse Row, attached construction, shared walls going east. This block is attached row houses. The construction is pre-war. The firewall between units is partial. There'll be roof access across the entire row if we can get through the access hatch. She looked at the ceiling. How many properties in the row before we reach a cross street? Junseo was already on the phone. 30 seconds. 6 units. And the cross street. Dickens. What's on Dickens? Residential. She'll have covered the obvious cross streets, but if we come off the roof 6 units east and come down through a building she's not watching. She stopped, calculated. Does she know this property? She knows the address, Taehyun said. Does she know the row? Does she know what comes after it? He looked at Junseo. Junseo said, unknown. Another impact, this one from directly above. They were on the roof now, or someone was, which changed the equation entirely. Taehyun heard it the same moment she did, and his hand came to her arm, not gripping, just contact, the kind that communicates move now without making it an order. They moved. The stairs were at the end of the hallway, and they went up rather than down. Wrong direction from every instinct, except the right one. Taehyun went first, gun up, moving in the controlled way of someone who'd learned it rather than been born to it, years of repetition making it structural. She stayed close. Junseo brought up the rear. 3rd floor. Attic access. Junseo produced a multi-tool from somewhere and had the hatch open in 90 seconds that felt like considerably more. Cold air dropped down. The sound of Chicago traffic. And above that, somewhere east on the row, footsteps on roofing material. She has someone on the roof, Amara said quietly. Yes. How many? Can't know. She looked up through the hatch at the sky. Charcoal and orange at the edges, the city never fully dark, the underside of clouds carrying the reflected light of 4 million lives being lived below them by people who had no idea what was happening on this particular rooftop. She thought about the ethics committee. She thought about what it meant to make a decision that cost you everything. She thought about the patient in Naperville who coached soccer on Saturdays. She thought, I am not the person who sat in the bar at 2 a.m. and told herself she had nothing left. I'll go first, she said. Taehyun's hand on her arm tightened by 1 degree. That's not... They're expecting you. She looked at him. They're not expecting me. And I know where I'm going. She met his eyes. The control, the assessment, and underneath it the thing that had been living next to guilt long enough to have its shape. Give me your secondary weapon. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. He reached into his jacket and produced something small and dark that she took in her right hand and held the way she'd been shown once, years ago, by a man she'd treated in the ER who'd been grateful enough to spend 3 hours talking, and she'd listened because she'd understood even then that knowledge had a way of arriving before you knew you'd need it. 3 properties east, she said, then down. The access will be a maintenance door on the interior stairwell. I know, he said. Stay close. She went through the hatch. The cold hit her immediately, and the wind off the lake came across the rooftops without anything to slow it down, and somewhere 2 properties east she could hear footsteps that were trying to be quiet and were not quite quiet enough. Below them the city hummed. Above them the sky was beginning, barely, to consider the possibility of dawn. She moved east across the roofing material, placing her feet the way she placed surgical instruments. Deliberate, committed, no hesitation because hesitation was where things went wrong. Behind her she could feel Taehyun's presence, close, the warmth of it against the cold air. 1 property over. The low wall between units, 8 inches of old brick. She stepped over it without slowing. 2 properties. She heard the footstep close. Too close. Wrong direction. And turned. A man. Wide, dark jacket, something in his hand that was already coming up. She had about 3/4 of a second. She used all of it. What she did was not the clean nerve strike from the bar. This was faster, less precise, more committed. She stepped inside his reach before the weapon had the angle it needed, drove her elbow into the side of his jaw, and when he stumbled, she shoved him hard toward the low wall. He hit it at the wrong angle for his momentum and went down. Not off the roof, just down, onto the gravel surface, and she was already moving 3 steps east. Don't stop, don't look back, because there was always another one, and stopping was where people died. She heard Tae-hyun dispatch the second one behind her with a sound that was brief and complete. Third property. She found the roof hatch. It was locked from the inside. She looked at the lock. She looked at Tae-hyun. He looked at the lock and then drove his heel into the frame twice with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd done it before, and on the second impact it gave. They went down. Inside an empty property, dark, unfurnished, smelling of dry air and disuse. They moved through it in the dark by feel in the faint ambient light from the windows. Tae-hyun's hand briefly on her shoulder when she slowed at an obstacle, removed the moment she moved again. Ground floor. Interior door to a back corridor. She found it, tried it, opened. An alley, narrow. A single dumpster and a cat that regarded them with complete indifference. She leaned against the exterior wall and breathed. Just breathed. Let the shake that had been waiting in her legs arrive and be acknowledged, and then be managed. 10 seconds. She gave herself 10 seconds. Tae-hyun was watching her, not with concern exactly, something that had concern in it, but wasn't only concern. "Junseo," she said. "Coming." His phone was already out. 2 seconds. "He's out. West End. He'll meet us." She nodded, looked at the alley. "We can't go back to the townhouse." "No." "She knows every property you have a record of." "Yes." "So where do we go?" He was quiet for a moment. The cat got bored with them and disappeared. Somewhere several streets over, she could hear the beginning of a siren. Someone had reported something, the city machinery beginning to respond. "There's one place," he said. "Off record, completely." "How off record?" "It's not mine." He looked at her. "It's my sister's. She lives in Seoul. She hasn't been in Chicago in 4 years. Nobody in my organization knows about it." Amara absorbed this. A safe house that wasn't a safe house. An ordinary apartment attached to a person who existed outside the architecture of everything Evelyn had been mapping. "Does your sister know?" "She knows I have a key for emergencies. This qualifies." "Yes." A pause. "I've never used it." She looked at him. The alley, the cat gone, the siren getting slightly closer. He was telling her something in that, not just a logistical detail, something about what this night had become that was different from every other emergency he'd navigated. She didn't say any of that. She said, "Call Junseo. Tell him the location." He did. They moved through the alley toward the street, staying close to the wall, and she was thinking about Evelyn, the lawyer's brain, the institutional judo, the systematic dismantling of every advantage. And she was thinking about what you do when someone has mapped everything you are. You become something they haven't mapped yet. She didn't know, walking out of that alley into a Chicago morning that was cold and ordinary and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened on its rooftops, that becoming something unmapped was going to require her to reach into the part of herself she'd buried 6 years ago and been trying to keep buried ever since. She didn't know that Evelyn had one more card she hadn't played. She didn't know that card had a name. And the name was something from Amara's past, from before, from the part of the story that the ethics committee had filed away and called finished. She would know by nightfall. The sister's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Pilsen that smelled like fresh paint and old wood and the specific kind of quiet that belongs to a place nobody's been living in. Tae-hyun found the key in the false bottom of a fire extinguisher cabinet in the stairwell. His sister's idea, he said. Not his. She'd always been careful in ways he'd taken for granted. Amara didn't say anything. She walked through the apartment in the gray morning light and did what she always did. Mapped it, margins and all, found the one window that didn't fully lock, noted the building's interior staircase accessed through a door 2 units down. Then she sat on the floor with her back against the wall because her legs had run out of willingness to pretend, and she stayed there. Junseo arrived 18 minutes later with 3 things: a bag of supplies, a laptop, and an expression that had crossed from controlled stillness into something she was starting to recognize as his version of dread. He set the bag down, looked at Tae-hyun, said something in Korean that was short and had edges to it. In English, Tae-hyun said. Junseo looked at Amara on the floor. Back to Tae-hyun. She used a name. In the message to the pier authority, she used a name to get the hold placed on the shipment. He paused. The name was Dr. Amara Brooks, attached to a narcotics trafficking investigation, filed 6 weeks ago. The floor was cold through Amara's coat. She registered the cold very precisely. There's no narcotics investigation. There is now, Junseo said. She created the paper. It's real enough to hold city level, won't survive scrutiny, but it doesn't need to survive scrutiny. It just needs to exist for 72 hours. Why 72 hours? Taehyun said. Because that's how long until the shipment has to clear or return to international waters. If it returns, Junseo stopped. The buyers walk, Taehyun said, and the debt structure attached to the deal collapses. 3 separate obligations. Junseo's voice was flat. The organization can absorb one, not 3 simultaneously. Amara looked at the wall across from her. There it was. The card Evelyn hadn't played. Not a weapon, not a fire, not 12 men in the street. Her name. Filed in a city database 6 weeks ago, before the bar, before the card, before any of it. Evelyn had been building this before Taehyun had ever noticed Amara existed, which meant either Evelyn had anticipated his interest with impossible precision, or she didn't build this for me specifically, Amara said. Both men looked at her. This is a template. She built a framework she could attach to anyone Taehyun expressed interest in. Fill in the name, file the paper, activate when needed. She looked at Junseo. How long ago was the framework created? Junseo checked his phone. 30 seconds. The base filing is 9 weeks old. Before the bar. 3 weeks before. Amara absorbed that. 3 weeks before she'd walked into the Sapphire Lounge, Evelyn O'Connor had built a trap for a person who didn't exist yet, whoever Taehyun would eventually look at. Professional, patient, surgical. She's been watching you longer than you knew, Amara said. Taehyun's jaw was doing the thing. Yes. And the person who built it, on her legal side. She'd have used a real attorney, someone who could file real adjacent paperwork that holds long enough to function. We're working on identifying. It doesn't matter right now. Amara pushed herself up from the floor. Her legs complained. She ignored them in the thorough way she'd learned in residency, the discipline of continuing to function past the body's objections. What matters is the 72 hours. How do we move the shipment through a hold? We don't, Junseo said. Not through legitimate channels. The hold is official. Then we go around the peer authority. She looked at Taehyun. You said the new peer authority required your physical confirmation. That was the arrangement after September. What changed in September? He was watching her with the quality of attention she'd felt at table 7. The full weight of it, nothing else competing. The previous peer director retired. And the new one required a personal relationship. Yes. Have you met with him in person? Once. So he knows your face, but not much else. And Evelyn got to him, but she got to him through leverage rather than relationship. The filing gives her leverage. It doesn't give her his loyalty. She was moving now, thinking on her feet, the way she'd thought through surgical approaches, the variables reorganizing themselves around the central problem. What does he want? Not what Evelyn has on him. What does he actually want? Port director 3 years into the role, Taehyun said slowly, wants to survive the next city budget review, wants his department to look effective. Effective how? Reduced contraband, cleaner manifests, numbers he can present to the city council. Then give him numbers. She looked at him. What can you give him that makes his department look good without touching your shipment? Taehyun was quiet for 6 seconds. There's a separate operation moving through the South Pier, not mine. Competitor. Can you expose it? I can, without tying it to you. With the right framing. Then that's the trade. You hand him a real bust, clean, documented, nothing that points back to you. And in exchange, the hold on your shipment gets reviewed and found to be based on insufficient evidence. She paused. How quickly can you put together the documentation on the South Pier operation? Junseo and Taehyun looked at each other. Something passed between them that was years of working together compressed into a glance. 6 hours, Junseo said. We have 72. We have less. Junseo's voice was careful. Evelyn knows the shipment is the pressure point. She'll move to make the hold permanent before the 72 hours are up. She won't wait. How long do we actually have? A pause. 18, maybe 20. Amara nodded, then stopped standing here. The next 8 hours were the closest thing she'd had to a surgical shift in 6 years. Junseo worked the documentation. Taehyun worked his remaining trusted contacts. 3 people, she understood, that he was certain about in the specific way you can only be certain after everything else has been stripped away. She sat at the kitchen table with the laptop and worked the problem she was actually equipped to work. The fabricated investigation had her name on it, but it also had a case number, a filing date, and a detective's signature. The detective's name was real. She found him in 40 minutes through public department records, but the case was not his. He hadn't filed it. Someone had used his credentials without his knowledge, which meant Evelyn's legal person had access to the city filing system at a level that required either an inside connection or a very specific technical capability. She followed the technical thread. She was not a hacker. She'd never claimed to be. But she'd spent 6 years as an administrator in a healthcare system, which meant she understood how institutions protected their databases, and more specifically, how they failed to protect them. She understood the gap between the official security policy and the actual implementation, between what IT said the system did and what it actually did at 2 in the morning when nobody was watching. She found the insertion point at hour 3. A ghost credential, real on the surface, attached to a retired administrator's account that hadn't been properly closed. She documented it. She built a chain that went from the ghost credential to the filing to the real detective's co-opted signature, and she put it together in a format that looked like what it needed to look like: evidence of fabrication, organized for someone who needed to act on it quickly. At hour 6, she sent it to an email address that Taehyun provided without explanation. She didn't ask for the explanation. At hour 7, Junseo's phone rang, and he stepped into the other room and came back looking like a pressure valve had been turned 1 degree toward release. The peer director wants a meeting. With who? Taehyun said. Both of you. Amara looked up from the laptop. Me. He knows you're the source of the fabrication documentation. He wants to see the person who built the chain. She thought about what that meant. A port director, pressured by Evelyn, now looking at evidence that the pressure was built on fraud, deciding which direction the risk ran. When? 2 hours. Where? The Port Authority building, his office. She closed the laptop. He'll have Evelyn's people watching the building. Yes, Taehyun said. She'll know we're going in. Yes. She looked at him. The apartment was bright now, mid-morning light coming through windows that hadn't been opened in months, dust moving in the beams. He was standing at the kitchen counter with the specific posture of a man who hadn't slept and wasn't going to acknowledge it, his jacket off for the first time, the gun on the counter beside him like a tool rather than a threat. She wants us in the open, Amara said. The Port Authority building is public. She can't hit us inside it. She doesn't need to hit us inside it. No, she understood. She'll take the approach. Before we get in. So we need a way in she's not watching. He looked at her. The building plans. She was already thinking it. The Port Authority building, lakefront, the architecture of a city institution built in the 1960s with the particular infrastructure decisions of that era. Utility connections, maintenance access, the layers that accumulated over 60 years of additions and renovations. Do you have access to the full historical plans? Junseo was already on his phone. She spent the next 90 minutes in the bathroom of the Pilsen apartment, which was the only room with both a mirror and enough space to think, going over the plans Junseo sent to her phone and building the route. Not because she doubted Taehyun's tactical capacity, but because this was her brain-specific ability, the spatial memory, the three-dimensional mapping, the understanding of how a building breathed, and she had stopped pretending she didn't have it. She came out at the 90-minute mark. There's a steam tunnel connection from the adjacent municipal garage, built in 1987 for the utility infrastructure expansion. It's not in the current maintenance documentation because it was decommissioned in 2009, but decommissioned doesn't mean sealed. How do you know it's not sealed? Junseo said. Because sealed costs money, and Chicago doesn't spend money on things that aren't broken. She showed him the map on her phone. The garage entrance is here, sublevel 2. The tunnel runs 200 feet to the Port Authority's mechanical room. From mechanical to the building's interior is a service elevator that requires a key but not a card. It's old enough to predate electronic access. Tae-hyun looked at the map. And the service elevator key. She looked at Jun-seo. Jun-seo looked at his phone. 20 minutes, he said, which she was beginning to understand meant he had people and resources she was only seeing the surface of. 20 minutes, she said. It took 17. The garage was cold and smelled like exhaust and standing water. Sublevel 2 was empty at this hour. A Tuesday morning, the long-term parking rows sparse, the fluorescent tubes in 2 of every 3 fixtures either dead or flickering. They moved fast and low through it, Tae-hyun ahead of her, Jun-seo behind, and she registered the formation, her in the middle, protected, and registered her reaction to it, which was complicated and not something she had time for. The decommissioned tunnel entrance was behind a utility panel that had been painted over twice, but whose outline was still visible if you knew what you were looking for. Jun-seo had a pry tool. 40 seconds, and the panel swung out. The tunnel was everything she'd expected, and worse. 200 feet of low clearance, standing water at the midpoint, pipes on both sides radiating heat that had nowhere to go. She went through it with her coat off and tied around her waist because the temperature was somewhere around 90 degrees and her body was already running hot from 8 hours of sustained pressure. The mechanical room at the other end was enormous, loud with the building's infrastructure, and lit with the orange of ancient safety lighting. The service elevator was where the plan said it would be. Jun-seo had the key. The elevator moved slowly, with a sound that made her jaw tighten, but it moved. 4th floor. The elevator opened onto a service corridor. Tae-hyun went through the door first. The port director's office was at the end of a hallway that was normal, institutional, the kind of bureaucratic corridor that looked the same in every city building. Drop ceilings, carpet that had been replaced once since the building was built, doors with frosted glass. A receptionist who looked up at them with the expression of someone whose morning had already been difficult. "Kang Tae-hyun," he said. "The director is expecting me." She looked at him, looked at Amara. Something behind her desk shifted. A tell, not much of one, the micro-expression of someone doing a calculation. She picked up her phone. Amara watched the hallway behind them. 40 seconds for the receptionist's call to go wherever it was going, and for whatever was on the other end to respond. 40 seconds was a long time when you were counting it. The inner door opened. The port director was 50-something, heavy-set, with the eyes of a man who'd been making risk assessments since before Amara was born and was currently making one in real time. He looked at Tae-hyun. He looked at Amara. He did not look at the service access door they'd come from or ask about it. "Come in," he said, quickly. His name was Director Frank Ostrowski, and he closed the door and locked it and stood with his back against it and said, before any of them said anything, "She has 2 people in the lobby, has had them since 7 this morning." "We know," Tae-hyun said. "She called me at 6. Ostrowski's voice was doing the specific work of a man managing fear without letting it run. "Told me the review of the hold needed to happen today, that there was new evidence." He looked at Amara. "Then I received your chain of custody documentation at 8:15. You built that in, 3 hours?" 6, she said. "With what access?" "Public records and the gap between your IT policy and your IT reality." He studied her. "You were a surgeon." "I was." "You do this kind of forensic work regularly." "First time." Something moved in his face. He crossed to his desk, sat down. Put both hands flat on the surface in the gesture of a man who's made a decision and is settling into it. "The fabricated credential traces to a legal firm. I verified it against your chain after I received the documentation. Firm is called Aldrin Consulting, operates as a legitimate compliance consultancy. It's a front." "Evelyn's?" Tae-hyun said. "Almost certainly. I can't prove it in the next 6 hours." He looked at Tae-hyun. What I can do is review the hold on the basis of fabricated supporting documentation and find it insufficient. That review takes 3 hours administratively. By noon, your shipment clears. And in exchange, Taehyun said. Ostrowski's hands were still flat on the desk. The South Pier operation. I need the documentation to be ironclad. My department makes that bust. It solves 3 months of pressure from the city council about port security numbers. It will be ironclad. I also need something else. Ostrowski looked at Amara directly. The fabricated investigation against Dr. Brooks. I can flag it for review, but to pull it completely, I need someone at the city attorney's office to process the fraud filing. That takes, normally, 10 days. We need it gone before she uses it again, Amara said. I know what you need. Ostrowski was quiet for a moment. I know someone. In the city attorney's office. She owes me a significant professional debt, and she's been waiting for an opportunity to pay it. He picked up his desk phone. Actual landline, she noticed. Old school, nothing electronic about it. She can expedite, same day, if I call now. Then call, Taehyun said. Ostrowski picked up the receiver, dialed, waited. In the silence of waiting, Amara heard it. From the hallway, outside the frosted glass of the office door, the specific quality of sound that had changed. Not the receptionist. Something else. Footsteps that were trying not to be. She looked at Taehyun. He was already looking at the door. He moved to the side of the door. Not in front of it, the side. And she did the same, opposite side. The instinct so immediate she registered it after she was already doing it. Ostrowski, phone to his ear, watched them, and to his credit kept his voice even when someone answered on the other end. The footsteps stopped outside the door. One beat of stillness that was too long. The door handle moved, locked. It stopped. Then something was inserted into the lock. A pick or a specialized key, the metallic whisper of tumblers being convinced. And Taehyun was already in motion as the door opened. One man. Large, dark jacket, recognizable by type, if not by face, as the same category of problem she'd encountered on the rooftop 12 hours ago. He came through the door and Taehyun had him before he was fully inside. Controlled, precise, the way someone handles a situation they've handled before, one hand controlling the weapon arm, the other at the back of the neck, and the man went down against the door frame with a sound that was brief and structural. Taehyun held him there, looked into the hallway. One more. Outside the stairwell. Amara went to the window. The Port Authority building faced the lake. 4 stories of Chicago glass looking out at the gray November water and the industrial skyline of the eastern port facilities. And in the parking structure across the street, a dark SUV positioned at an angle that was not how civilians parked. She's watching the building, Amara said. She knows we're here. She's been watching since we arrived, Taehyun said. Then why only one in the hallway? He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at something she wasn't seeing yet. She's not trying to stop the meeting, he said slowly. She wants us to leave. Amara thought about it, turned it over. The man in the hallway, the SUV across the street, the calculated minimalism of the pressure, just enough to make them feel exposed, not enough to actually stop anything. She knows we came in through the service access. She doesn't know exactly which route. She wants us to use the main exit, he said, to get back to the route she can see. Ostrowski had finished the call. He was watching this exchange with the expression of a man updating his risk model in real time. My contact will process the fraud filing. 4 hours. Thank you, Amara said. She meant it simply, and it came out that way. Junseo appeared from the service corridor he'd positioned himself in. One look between him and Taehyun. Second man is handled, he said, which she'd stopped asking for elaboration on. Ostrowski looked at the man on his floor. I'll need that to be not here when I make the call to my security team. 5 minutes, Taehyun said. He looked at Amara. She looked at him. They were standing in the port director's office at 11:15 in the morning with a solved problem and a new one, which was the pattern this had followed since the tunnel under Erie Street, and she was beginning to understand that this was simply the shape of the world he lived in, Problems didn't resolve, they transformed, and the skill was not in elimination, but in management. She had spent 6 years telling herself she was bad at that. She went to the window again. The SUV, the building's angle, the street grid of the Eastern Port District, and the lake behind it, and the industrial geometry of the pier facilities. She thought about Evelyn waiting somewhere, not in the SUV, too exposed, waiting and watching and doing the calculation about what Amara and Taehyun were doing in that building. Evelyn thought she had them triangulated. Lobby covered, building approached from the main exit side, the SUV watching the only visible departure route. She doesn't know about the tunnel, Amara said. No. And she'll keep waiting for us to emerge from the front. Yes. She looked at him. How long can we keep her waiting? He understood where she was going. How long do you need? Long enough to change where the trap is. She turned from the window. She's been reactive to us since the townhouse. We've been moving. She's been following. What we need is to stop moving and make her come to us. She won't come to a location she doesn't control. She'll come to a location she thinks she controls. Amar leaned against the wall. The warehouse. You mentioned the port facilities, so you have access to the pier buildings? Inactive ones? 3. She knows about them? Taehyun was quiet for a moment. She knows about 2. The third was acquired through a holding company with 3 layers of separation. It's clean. Then that's where this ends. She looked at him with the full weight of what she was proposing, not softening it. We leak that you're moving the shipment through manually, that you're going to the pier building to personally oversee the transfer. We make the leak look like one of your people, her remaining source. Something credible, something that explains how she found out. And when she comes to the pier building, she comes because she thinks she's cornered you, because she thinks the shipment transfer makes you vulnerable, and your people are spread thin and she has numerical advantage. Amar's voice was level. And when she gets there, she finds out she's wrong about all of it. Taehyun looked at her for a long moment. Ostrowski had made himself very quiet behind his desk. My people will need time to position, Taehyun said. How much? 4 hours. Evelyn's patience under pressure runs about 6 based on her pattern over the past 48 hours. Amara did the calculation. We have the window. There's a problem, Junseo said. Both of them looked at him. The leak has to be credible. To make her believe she's received real intelligence from inside the organization, the information has to come with authentication she can verify. He paused. She'll need something real, something she can independently confirm. What kind of something? Amara said. A name, an identity inside the organization she can check against her own information. You're saying we give her a name of someone real. We give her a name of someone who's already gone. Junseo looked at Taehyun. Young-soo knew the pier building. He visited it twice before the ambush. Young-soo, who had a daughter in Evanston who thought her father was a logistics manager. Amara felt the weight of using a dead man's name and credentials as bait, and she didn't look away from the weight of it. She'll verify that he's dead. She'll verify that he existed and had access to the right information. The timing of the leak predates news of his death by 2 hours. She won't find the confirmation fast enough to disqualify it. Amara looked at Taehyun. His face was doing what it did when he was carrying something he wasn't going to put down. Your call, she said quietly. He was still for several seconds. Set it up, he said. They left through the tunnel at noon. The Pilsen apartment for 4 hours, which she spent in a state she recognized from the long shifts. The particular suspension of someone who has made every preparation they can and now has to wait for the situation to arrive. She drank coffee. She ate half a sandwich Junseo produced from somewhere. She sat with her back against the wall, the same wall as this morning, and looked at Gerald on the windowsill. Taehyun sat at the kitchen table with his phone and worked. Calls, coordination, the operational logistics of positioning 20 men in a warehouse during daylight without being observed. She watched him peripherally and understood, watching, that this was someone who had built a world with his hands and his will and was now fighting to keep it from being taken apart by someone who was very nearly as capable. Nearly. At 2:30, he set the phone down and looked at her. She took the bait. Amara felt her pulse do something. How do you know? She pulled her people from the Port Authority building 20 minutes ago. She's redirecting. She's moving to the pier. She'll position first. She'll want 2 hours to set up. He looked at the clock on the microwave. Which means she'll be in place by 5. And your people? Already there. She nodded, stood up, put her coat on. Tell me the layout of the warehouse. He told her. She asked 17 questions and he answered all of them, and the answers built in her mind the architecture of the final move, the catwalks, the loading doors, the electrical panel that controlled the building's main power, the darkness that would follow when the power cut, the positions of his men in the elevated infrastructure, invisible until they weren't, and Evelyn arriving with numerical advantage into a space that looked like her victory and was the precise shape of its opposite. She'll come herself, Amara said, not just her people. Yes. She's been building this for months. She won't delegate the ending. Amara looked at him. And she'll come for me specifically. She's heard about the rooftop. She knows I've been the one reading her moves. I know. Which means she'll want to handle me herself. Which means she'll separate from her main force at some point. That's the moment. Yes. She pulled her coat closed. That's the moment. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the tunnel. The air pressure change, the full attention. You don't have to be inside, he said. The trap works without you being physically present. The trap works better with me physically present. She held his gaze. She underestimates me. She's been doing it since she put my name on a fabricated filing because she assumed I was leverage, not a factor. That's the last assumption she gets to make. Taehyun was quiet. His jaw. His eyes. I need you to trust me, she said. Not protect me. Trust me. The difference between those two things sat between them for a long moment. I know the difference, he said. I know you do. He picked up his phone, made one more call, said 3 words in Korean, set it down. We leave at 4, he said. She nodded, sat back down against the wall, closed her eyes for 15 minutes because she'd learned in residency to take sleep in whatever increment the situation offered, and because she was going to need everything she had in the next 3 hours, and because somewhere across the city, Evelyn O'Connor was positioning 30 armed people in a warehouse on Chicago's industrial waterfront and telling herself she had already won. She hadn't. But she didn't know that yet, and in 4 hours, in the dark of an abandoned warehouse while a midnight storm came off the lake and the city ground forward indifferent, as always, Amara was going to be the one who told her. They left the Pilsen apartment at 4 o'clock into a city that didn't know what was coming. The sky had been building something all day. The specific gray of a Chicago November that means business, clouds stacking in from the lake, with the patient accumulation of something that had been traveling a long way and was done traveling. The temperature had dropped 11 degrees since noon. The wind off the water came in gusts that hit like a flat hand. Amara sat in the back of the car and watched the city move past the windows and thought about nothing she didn't need to think about. That was the discipline. The thing she'd learned in the ER when the situation required everything you had, and the way to give everything you had was to stop spending it on anticipation. Feel the seat under you, the temperature of the air, the weight of the secondary weapon still inside her coat pocket where she'd kept it since the rooftop. Taehyun sat beside her. The 12 inches between them had become something different over the past 18 hours. Not smaller exactly, but differently occupied. He'd been on the phone for the first 20 minutes of the drive, and then he'd put it away and he was doing what she was doing. The discipline of not spending what you'd need. She watched the industrial waterfront appear as they came east. The cranes first, enormous against the loaded sky. Then the warehouses, the pier facilities. The geometry of a city's unglamorous infrastructure laid bare at the edge of the lake. She'd never spent much time out here. It was the part of Chicago that the city turned its back to. The working skeleton that kept everything else functioning and was never in the photographs. How many of hers inside, she said. 12 confirmed, possibly 18. Taehyun kept his eyes forward. She'll hold her primary force at the perimeter until she's certain we're inside. And your people? 23. Positioned since 3 o'clock. He paused. She's been watching the main approach since 2. She hasn't seen anyone go in. Because they came in through the water side. The pier has a service dock. She nodded. She thought about 23 people sitting in the dark of a warehouse in the cold for an hour, waiting. She thought about the kind of loyalty that required and what it cost to earn. The power panel, she said. Your man has it. When you signal. What's the signal? He looked at her. Your call. Whatever you have access to in the moment. She absorbed that. Whatever she had in the moment, not a planned signal, a reactive one, because plans met reality, and what survived was the capacity to read the gap and work with what was there. He understood that. He was telling her he understood it. All right, she said. Junseo pulled the car into an alley 2 blocks from the pier building and stopped. From here they walked, not toward the main approach, which Evelyn had eyes on, but along the water's edge through the industrial corridor, the wind coming straight off the lake now and carrying the first suggestion of rain. Amara pulled her coat tighter. Her left shoe, the repaired one, held. She noted this with something that was almost gratitude. The warehouse was enormous, one of the old ones, pre-war construction, steel and brick 4 stories high with loading doors on the street side and the pier side and the catwalks running the interior at the 2nd and 3rd levels. It smelled like machinery and lake water and decades of freight. When the side door closed behind them, the sound of the city diminished to something distant, and what replaced it was the breathing of an empty building, the wind working against the exterior, the structure settling, and somewhere above them in the dark, 23 people being very still. Amara stood inside the door and let her eyes adjust. The building's emergency lighting gave a thin orange glow at the exits. Everything else was shapes and depth. The stacked equipment, the crane apparatus, the loading docks, the vertical columns that held the catwalk structure. She memorized the distances the way she'd memorized every floor plan since the tunnel. Muscle memory, now. Taehyun moved beside her, barely audible. She'll enter through the loading doors on the street side. Standard approach. 2 men first, then the main body. And she'll come last, Amar said, equally quiet. She'll want to see it secured before she enters. Yes. So we need to be visible before she comes in. Her advance team needs to see us and confirm we're here and then report back. That's the moment they stop looking for what else is in the building. Exactly. She looked at him. Where do you want to be when the lights go? Northeast column, cover to the catwalk ladder. He looked at her. The orange emergency light made his face into shapes and shadow. Where do you want to be? She'd been deciding this since he'd described the layout. Center floor, open. He was still. That puts you visible, available. When she comes in past her advance team, she'll come straight for me. She held his gaze in the dark. That's the point. Amarash, I know what I'm doing. He was quiet for a long moment. She could feel the conflict in him. Not just tactical, something beneath that, the thing that had been building since the bar and had no clean name yet. The moment she separates from her people, he said, the moment she moves toward you, that's when the lights go. Give me 30 seconds of dark first. Why? Because I need her close. She looked at him steadily. I know what I'm doing, she said again, and it wasn't reassurance, it was information, delivered the way she delivered diagnoses, clearly without apology. He held her gaze, nodded once. They moved to their positions in the dark. Evelyn's advance team came through the loading doors at 7 minutes past 6. Amara knew the moment it happened, not because she saw it, but because the quality of the air in the building changed. The specific pressure shift of a large space being entered, the sound of attention redistributing itself among 23 people in the dark above her who had heard the same thing. She stood in the center of the warehouse floor, didn't move. Visible. The emergency lighting reached her at this distance, barely, enough to be a shape against the dark. She kept her hands at her sides and her breathing even and counted the footsteps. 2 men. Then 2 more. Then the main body. She counted by sound, the collective weight of movement, 8 or 10 at least, spreading across the loading dock end with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. Equipment lights came on, Flashlights, tactical, sweeping the space methodically. One of the lights found her. She didn't move. A voice. Male. Sharp. "She's here. Center floor. Alone." Murmured communication. Radio crackle. The advance team holding position. And then, 30 seconds after the main body, the loading door again. Evelyn O'Connor was not what Amara had built in her imagination over the past 4 days, and she was also exactly what she'd built. Shorter than expected, 5'4", maybe 5'5", in a coat that cost more than Amara's monthly rent, her hair dark and pulled back with the kind of precision that came from never letting anything be approximate. She was 50-something, and she moved like someone who had learned 20 years ago that the room always watches the person who enters last. She stood inside the loading door and looked at Amara across the distance of the warehouse floor. Then she smiled. It was the specific smile of someone who's won and wants you to know it. She walked forward, past her men, flanked by 2 who stayed close but stepped back when she raised one hand. Professional, controlled. The lawyer's habit of managing the room. She stopped 10 feet from Amara. "Smaller than I expected," Evelyn said. Her voice was low, conversational, the cadence of someone who didn't need volume to carry weight. Her eyes were doing something efficient and cold, the assessment of an opponent she'd already dismissed. "He described you like you were remarkable." "He's generous," Amara said. "He's compromised." Evelyn tilted her head. "That's what happens when men who should know better let sentiment in. They start seeing things that aren't there." Her gaze moved over Amara with the particular contempt of someone who has organized her life around never being what other people underestimated. "You're a secretary." "I was." "You're a woman who got caught up in something she didn't understand and made herself useful enough to keep around." Evelyn's voice was almost gentle, which was its cruelest register. "I don't blame you. He's convincing. The gravity of men like that, you feel it and you think it means something about you." She paused. "It doesn't." Amara said nothing. She was counting. Not time. The space between them, the positions of the 2 men flanking at Evelyn's rear, the angle of the flashlight beams and where they left darkness. "Where is he?" Evelyn said. "Close." "That's not an answer." "I know." Evelyn studied her. Something shifted fractionally behind her eyes. The first recalibration, the first suggestion that the shape of the room wasn't quite what she'd expected. She turned her head, a small controlled movement, and said to the flanking men, "Sweep the interior. Catwalks first." Amara moved her right hand and closed it once. Open, closed. "Whatever you have in the moment." The lights went out, total black. Not dim. The emergency lighting too, everything, the building breathing dark from every surface. And in the dark, before Evelyn's people could orient, before the tactical lights could reestablish the geometry of the space, Amara moved. Not away. Toward. 5 steps. She'd counted the distance. 10 feet closing to 0, and she had Evelyn before the first flashlight came back up. Left hand on the weapon arm, right hand at the wrist, the weapon redirected before it was fully in play. Evelyn was fast. Not surgical fast, but trained fast, the kind of speed you get from practice rather than understanding, and she pivoted into the grapple with something that connected against Amara's left shoulder, hard. Pain arrived like information. Amara filed it and kept moving. Above them, the warehouse exploded into chaos. Taehyun's people from the catwalks. The sound of it was enormous in the enclosed space, controlled bursts from elevated positions. Evelyn's men suddenly targets in a geometry they hadn't mapped, the flashlight beams becoming disorienting as they moved and fell. Evelyn drove her elbow back. Amara took it in the ribs, felt something protest violently, maintained the grip on the weapon arm. They were close. Too close for anything but ugly. And Amara could feel the strain in Evelyn's arm, the assessment happening in real time, the lawyer's brain running calculations even now. "Let go," Evelyn said through her teeth. "No." Evelyn shifted her weight and went for the knife at her belt with her free hand. Amara had seen it when she walked in, the specific line of it under the coat, and she'd planned for this. She drove her knee into Evelyn's thigh, not to incapacitate, to disrupt the reach, and got the free hand at the wrist before the knife cleared its sheath. 2 wrists, both controlled. Evelyn's weight pulling backward, Amara's pulling forward, the specific isometric stalemate of 2 people with nothing else available. Evelyn looked at her. 6 inches of darkness between their faces. Her breathing was audible now, controlled still but audible, the effort showing at the edges. "You practiced this," Evelyn said. "I studied the human body for 12 years, Amara said. "Every system, every failure point. And the knife? The wrist extension when you reach across your body. The angle makes it slow." She maintained the grip. "Breakable." Evelyn went very still. Above them, the sounds of the warehouse were shifting. Fewer voices, the specific quality of a fight that has resolved its balance in one direction. Amara could feel it without seeing it. Taehyun's people. "Your men are done," Amara said. "Some of them. Enough of them." A beat. Evelyn's eyes didn't change, cold and efficient and working even now, but her body made a small decision, a degree of release in the fighting tension that wasn't surrender but was recognition. "You're going to break my wrist." "I'm going to break your wrist," Amara confirmed, "if you move the wrong way. And I'm going to inject you with something that won't kill you but will make the next 6 hours profoundly educational." She felt Evelyn register the syringe in her right hand, palmed since before the lights went, drawn from her coat pocket in the dark. "Or you stop moving." Evelyn looked at the syringe, looked at Amara. Something moved through her face that was not the controlled surface, something older and less managed, the thing underneath the lawyer and the crime boss and the woman who'd built a trap 9 weeks before she had a target for it. She stopped moving. In the dark of the warehouse, with the lake wind hitting the exterior walls and the sounds of resolution above them on the catwalks, Amara held Evelyn O'Connor's wrists and breathed and felt the pain in her ribs and the cold from the door and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running at full capacity for 4 days and was still, somehow, running. Taehyun's voice from behind her. "Clear." She didn't release Evelyn. "All of them?" 11 of 18. 7 ran. A pause. "Junseo." "On it." Junseo's voice from somewhere in the dark. The emergency lighting came back on, partial, the orange glow returning to the exit points. And in it, Evelyn O'Connor stood with both wrists controlled and her weapon on the floor, and her face doing the final calculation of someone who has run out of moves and knows it. Amara released the wrists, stepped back 1 step, kept the syringe visible. Evelyn looked at it. "What is it?" "Succinylcholine, fast-acting paralytic. You'd be completely conscious and completely unable to move for approximately 40 minutes. She held Evelyn's gaze. "I prepped it from the supplies Junseo brought to the Pilsen apartment. I'm still capable of correct dosage after 6 years. She paused. "I'd rather not use it." "Then don't. Then sit down on the floor and put your hands where I can see them." Evelyn looked at her for one more moment. The full assessment, the final version of it, the one that accounted for everything she'd gotten wrong. Then she sat down on the warehouse floor in her expensive coat and put her hands flat on the concrete beside her and said nothing. Amara stepped back. Her ribs hurt with every breath. She let them. Taehyun appeared from the direction of the northeast column. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, and there was a cut above his right eyebrow that was bleeding into the crease of his eye, and he wasn't acknowledging either of these things. He looked at Evelyn on the floor. He looked at Amara. She saw it happen in his face, the controlled surface, and then, briefly, the thing beneath it. There and gone in 2 seconds. But she saw it. "You're hurt," he said. "Ribs, possibly cracked, probably bruised. I'll assess later." She kept her eyes on Evelyn. "She has a lawyer network running the fabricated credentials. The firm is Aldrin Consulting. I have documentation that traces the filing back to a ghost credential from the city attorney's office." "I know." "Ostrowski's contact in the city attorney's office is processing the fraud filing tonight." "I know that too." "Then what don't you know?" she said, and it came out edged with something she hadn't intended. The exhaustion, the pain, the 4 days of running finally pressing through. He was quiet for a moment. "Whether you're actually all right." She looked at him. Her ribs expanded with the breath and reminded her specifically of what had just happened. "I'll answer that later," she said. He nodded, looked down at Evelyn. "You're going to tell me about every operation you've run against my organization in the past year, every contact inside, every leveraged official, everything." He said it with the flatness that she'd learned meant he was completely certain. Tonight. Evelyn looked up at him. Her face had done something in the past few minutes. Not broken, nothing so simple, but recalibrated in some fundamental way, like a structure that's still standing but has admitted to itself that the foundation shifted. "You'll do what you do regardless," she said. "Yes." "Then what do I get for talking?" "A choice about how this ends." He said it without embellishment. "That's more than Youngsu and Minho got." The names sat in the warehouse. Evelyn looked at the floor, a long moment. Aldrin Consulting has 4 attorneys. 2 are on retainer with the city planning office as well. You'll want all 4. "Yes," Taehyun said. "I will." Evelyn talked. It took 3 hours. Junseo had a recorder. Amara sat on a crate 15 feet away and listened to the architecture of everything Evelyn had built over 8 months. The contacts, the leveraged officials, the 2 remaining operations her organization was running that hadn't been touched yet. The internal calendar of planned actions that were now going to be derailed one by one. Evelyn gave it up with the thoroughness of a woman who'd calculated the value of partial cooperation and found it insufficient. She gave it all. Not because she'd broken. Amara didn't think Evelyn was capable of breaking in the simple sense, but because she was a lawyer, and a lawyer could count. At some point during the second hour, Junseo appeared beside Amara with a first aid kit that he set on the crate next to her without comment. She took it without comment, assessed her ribs through her coat with the clinical efficiency of someone who had examined enough bodies to read her own the same way. Bruised, not cracked, she was fairly sure the specific quality of the pain was inflammatory rather than structural. She wrapped them herself, tightly, the way she'd wrapped dozens of other people's, and breathed experimentally through the result. Manageable. She thought about the word manageable and what it had come to mean over the past 4 days. When Evelyn finished talking, Taehyun made a phone call. 2 minutes. He came back and stood in front of Evelyn on the floor and said, "In 2 hours, you'll be transferred to a location where the information you've given me will be verified. After verification, you'll be handed to the federal investigators who've been building a case against your organization for 14 months. He paused. "The case has enough without tonight. Tonight's information accelerates it." Evelyn looked at him. "You're handing me to the feds." "Yes." "Not handling it yourself." "No." He said it without explanation, and in the not explaining was the explanation. The line he'd drawn, the one Amara had been watching him maintain through everything, the architecture of a man who did terrible things and had decided at some point that predated her, which terrible things he wouldn't do. Evelyn looked at the floor. "Huh," she said, which was the first uncalculated thing Amara had heard her say. They left the warehouse at 9:45. The storm had arrived fully in the hours they'd been inside. Rain coming hard and sideways off the lake, the wind doing what Chicago wind does, which is remind you that the city was built at the edge of something enormous that does not care about the city at all. The pier facilities were empty under it, the cranes standing in the dark, the water of the lake visible at the edge of the pier in the muted industrial light, enormous and restless. Amara stood outside the warehouse door for a moment and let the rain hit her. It was cold and it hurt against the bruised ribs, and she stood in it for about 30 seconds, which was long enough for what she needed it for. 30 seconds of something completely physical and unambiguous and present, cutting through the residue of the past 4 days. Then she moved toward the car. Taehyun fell into step beside her. The cut above his eyebrow had dried to a dark line. He hadn't had it looked at, and wasn't going to until she said something about it, which she decided to say. "The cut needs cleaning, and possibly 1 stitch, maybe 2. Later. Now is better. Scalp wounds bleed more than their severity suggests, and you've been running on adrenaline, which means you haven't noticed how much." He looked at her. "I know what I'm doing," she said, for the 3rd time, which they both knew by now had become something beyond its literal meaning. He stopped walking. "I know you do," he said, and that too had become something beyond its literal meaning. The rain came down between them. She reached into the first aid kit she was still carrying, and he stood still. The extraordinary stillness of him. The body that had learned complete control and now applied it to being examined, while she cleaned the cut with practiced hands. The motor memory of 10,000 small, precise actions still resident in her fingers after 6 years of trying to convince herself otherwise. 2 stitches, she said. You have... Junseo's kit is comprehensive. She looked at him. I noticed. Something almost moved in his face. He's thorough. Hold still. She worked in the rain, which was not ideal and was entirely characteristic of how this whole situation had operated, and he held still with the absolute discipline of someone who had trusted her completely in the moment she'd gone through the attic hatch first and was applying that same trust here. 2 sutures, small, clean. She'd done it 10,000 times under worse conditions. She tied off the second one and stepped back. The rain was soaking through her coat properly now, finding the collar and the cuffs, the cold of it reaching her skin. Her ribs ached in the dull systemic way of inflammation setting in. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Get in the car. They got in the car. Oh. She didn't go back to the Pilsen apartment Taehyun had offered. The sister's apartment, clean, safe, unchanged by everything that had happened since they'd left it that afternoon. She'd understood the offer for what it contained beyond the practical, and she'd told him she needed to go home. Home was 7 floors up in a building on the north side, where her budget spreadsheet was still on the kitchen table, and her neighbor Mrs. Okafor was apparently under the impression there had been a gas leak, and there was a new deadbolt on the door that Junseo had installed, she discovered, at some point between the first night they'd left and now. She let herself in, turned on the kitchen light, stood in the small circle of it and looked at the apartment. The spreadsheet, the cold tea she'd made before the tunnel, Gerald on the windowsill no longer leaning because someone, Junseo, it had to be Junseo, had repotted him in a slightly larger pot that hadn't been there before. She stood and looked at the repotted Gerald for a long moment. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and let 6 years of held things arrive. Not crying, or not only, more like the decompression after the long surgery, the walk to the break room, the sitting down, the body saying, you can stop now. She'd been stopping and starting for so long she'd forgotten what all the way stopped felt like. It felt like her kitchen at 11 at night with the rain against the window and her ribs wrapped tight, and a man she hadn't known 5 days ago who had sent someone to repot her succulent in the hours between one emergency and the next. She stayed there until the thing passed through, which took about 20 minutes. Then she washed her face, made tea, drank it standing at the counter looking at Gerald. The matte black card was still in the kitchen drawer. She opened the drawer and looked at it. She didn't pick it up, she just looked at it. The artifact of the moment everything had started, the weight of it in a drawer under takeout menus, ordinary and not ordinary at all. She closed the drawer. She went to bed. She slept until 8 the next morning, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep she'd had in longer than she could accurately recall. The days that followed had a specific quality she hadn't experienced before. The texture of aftermath, of things still moving but slower, the city reconstituting itself around the absence of a war that most of it hadn't known was happening. Ostrowski's contact cleared the fraudulent investigation against her name in 36 hours. She received an email notification that the case file had been closed due to insufficient evidence and supporting documentation found to be fabricated. No explanation, no apology, the institutional language of something being quietly buried. She read it twice and deleted it. The 4 attorneys at Aldrin Consulting were served with federal subpoenas within 72 hours of Evelyn's transfer. She read about it in a Tribune legal brief, 12 lines on page B4, beneath a story about a zoning dispute. The brief described it as a compliance investigation. She read those 12 lines 4 times. Evelyn O'Connor's organization, without its operational leadership, did what organizations do without leadership. It fragmented. The distribution points Junseo had confirmed fell quiet within a week. The remaining soldiers made their arrangements the way soldiers do when the war they were fighting is definitively over. The north side settled into the kind of uneasy equilibrium that Taehyun had described as the closest thing to peace this part of the city maintained. She didn't see Taehyun for 9 days. She heard from Jun Seo once on day 3. A text from an unknown number confirming that the fabricated filing was fully cleared and that she should encounter no further complications. She texted back, "Tell him I said thank you." Junseo texted back, "He says you're welcome. He also says Gerald looks better." She stared at that for a full minute before she put the phone down. She spent the 9 days doing the things she'd been doing before all of it, the job applications, the budget spreadsheet, the library Wi-Fi, but differently. The same tasks with different hands. She caught herself on day 4 working through a problem in the way she'd worked through the peer director situation. Mapping variables, reading systems for their gaps, moving from diagnosis to approach with the cold efficiency she'd spent 6 years trying to reclassify as something other than what it was. She stopped trying to reclassify it on day 5. She called her mother on day 6, talked for 2 hours, said nothing about any of it, which meant she said everything about it in the ways she'd always communicated with her mother, through what she chose to talk about and what she didn't, the shape of the conversation. Her mother, who had been reading her since she was 4 years old and was not fooled by anything, said at the end, "You sound different." Amara said, "Good different or bad different?" Her mother said, "I don't know yet. Check back in a month." She thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. On day 9, she opened her laptop and wrote an email she'd been composing in the back of her mind since the warehouse floor. She addressed it to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. She explained precisely and without ornamentation the circumstances of her license revocation 6 years prior, attached the documentation she'd pulled from public records, and the institutional memory she'd kept in a folder under her bed since it happened, and requested a formal review. She identified the administrative gap that had allowed a systemic failure to be attributed to her individual decision-making. She named the decision she'd made, the patient it had served, and the outcome. She attached a letter from the patient herself. She'd called on day 7, a conversation that was one of the harder things she'd done in a week full of hard things. And the woman in Naperville had said, "I've been waiting for you to call in a voice that made 6 years feel both very long and very short." She sent the email. She sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes afterward, looking at Gerald, who was visibly healthier in his new pot, the leaves fuller, the stems straight for the first time since she'd had him. Her phone rang. "I've been in Seoul," Tae-hyun said. "There were matters to handle. After everything." "I know." She did know. Junseo had mentioned it obliquely on day 6. "I wanted to call before I left. I should have." A pause. "I didn't know what to say." She looked at Gerald. "That's unusual for you." "Yes." Something in his voice that she'd heard once before. In the tunnel, when he'd thanked her for not leaving. The thing underneath the control, present and unmanaged. "How are your ribs?" "Better. How's the suture line?" "Junseo says it looks clean. He checked." "Tell him he's welcome." A silence that wasn't empty. Outside, Chicago was doing something. Wind, traffic, the perpetual machinery of a city that processed everything through its forward motion and didn't look back. "I want to show you something," he said. "When I'm back, next week." "What is it?" "A building. On the west side." He paused. "I bought it 8 months ago. I had a different use in mind at the time. The use has changed." Another pause. "I'd like your opinion on it." She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, and she thought about the ethics committee and the folder under her bed, and the email she'd sent 11 minutes ago, and the patient in Naperville who coached soccer on Saturdays. "A building," she said. "Medical-grade construction, 4 floors. The previous tenant was a diagnostic center. Most of the infrastructure is still in place." She was quiet for a moment. The specific kind of quiet that isn't the absence of thought, but its full presence, running too much to surface as words. "You didn't ask me," she said finally. "No." "You just bought a building." "I bought a building 8 months ago, for different reasons." His voice was careful but not constructed. Careful the way someone is careful with something they don't want to drop. "What I'm asking now is whether you'll look at it." She looked at Gerald, the straight stem, the fuller leaves, the new pot that fit him. "Next week?" she said. "Yes." "I'll look at it." Well, she looked at it on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the warehouse, on a morning that was cold and clear, in the specific way of Chicago in late November when the storm has passed and the city comes out the other side with its bones showing. The building was on Madison Street, 3 blocks from the medical district, in a neighborhood that was between things. Not yet what it was becoming, not quite what it had been. 4 stories of brick, clean lines, large windows that caught the morning light and did something useful with it. She stood in front of it with her hands in her coat pockets for about a minute. Taehyun stood beside her. He'd come back from Seoul looking like someone who had settled accounts there and was carrying the weight of what settling costs. It was in his posture, faint, the millimeter of additional gravity. He'd been in the city 4 days, and this was the first time she'd seen him. They'd stood outside the building for the minute without speaking, which by now felt like a complete language. "Show me the inside," she said. He had a key. The interior smelled like empty space and old light and the specific neutrality of a building waiting to become something. The diagnostic infrastructure was still in place on the 2nd and 3rd floors. She walked through it, and her hands moved over equipment the way they hadn't moved over anything in 6 years, reading it the way a person reads a language they grew up speaking and spent years pretending they'd forgotten. She stood in what had been the main examination suite on the 3rd floor and looked out the large window at Madison Street. "It needs work," she said. "I know." The imaging infrastructure is mostly salvageable. The lab space is current spec. The exam suites need complete refitting. "I know." The licensing process for a new medical center is significant. Time, capital, regulatory. She turned from the window. Even with the review petition approved, it takes 18 months minimum to go from revocation review to active practice. "I'm aware." "You've already looked into it." "Yes." She looked at him across the empty suite, the morning light coming through the window behind her. He was standing with his hands at his sides, and she understood that he'd spent considerable effort on this and was now presenting it with no pressure, no angle, just the building and the information and the fact of his presence. "Why?" she said. "Because I said no one would harm you, and I've kept that. But that's not—" He stopped, looked at the window. "That's not the same as what I actually want." "What do you actually want?" He looked back at her. The directness, always. The thing that had hit her like a pressure change in the bar and had never once let up. "I want you to be able to do what you were made to do. I want the city to have what you can give it. And I want—" A pause that she recognized as real. "I want to be in a position to see that, if you'll allow it." She thought about what it meant to allow something. She thought about the 12-inch border in the back of the car, and the tunnel, and the rooftop, and Gerald in his new pot. She thought about the controlled surface of him, and the thing beneath it that had been present since the bar, and had been choosing, since the bar, to show itself to her in increments. She thought about the patient in Naperville and the email in the folder under her bed and the 6 years. She thought about a nerve strike she'd told herself she'd forgotten. "The building needs a name," she said. Something happened in his face that was not the quarter-degree recalibration she'd gotten used to reading. Something fuller. Still controlled, still him, but present in a way that he wasn't arranging. "I thought you might want to choose it," he said. She turned back to the window. Madison Street, the morning light, the neighborhood between things on its way to what it was becoming. 3 blocks from the medical district, a building with its bones already right, waiting for what came next. "I have a list of applications pending," she said, "from a month ago. Positions I applied to because I needed to pay rent. Yes. I'll need to withdraw them properly. Write actual withdrawal letters, not just go silent." She looked at the equipment along the wall. "I'd also need to notify the library that I won't be needing the Wi-Fi quite as much. Of course. And I want a real role, not administered, not managed." She turned to look at him. "Medical director, operational authority over everything clinical, no interference." "Yes." "You don't even—" "Yes," he said again, and the flatness of it, the absolute no-performance certainty of it, was the most complete thing she'd heard from him, which was considerable given that he didn't waste words. She looked at him for a long moment, the building around them, the light, the weight of 6 years and 4 days and everything in between. "I want to bring in 2 other physicians," she said. "People I trained with. They're both currently in positions they shouldn't be in. I'll have Junso coordinate whatever support they need. And I want it clean, completely. No connection to anything that it's already structured that way. The holding company has 4 layers and a legitimate charter. The funding is clean capital from 6 different sources, none of them traceable to me in any documentation that will survive scrutiny. She looked at him. You've been planning this. Since the safe house. He held her gaze. Since you told me about the patient in Naperville. She was quiet. Outside, a bus went up Madison Street, and the building absorbed the sound of it and gave it back as the quiet of a space that had walls and could hold things. It's going to take time, she said. The review, the licensing, refitting the suites. I have time. I'm not... She stopped, tried again. I'm not easy. I've been told that. I make decisions unilaterally, and I don't reconsider them, and I'm not interested in being managed. I know. You say that like it's not a problem. It's not. He looked at her with the directness that had not let up once in 14 days. It's never been a problem. She turned back to the window, Madison Street, the light, the city grinding forward. I want to see the 4th floor, she said. He came to stand beside her and looked out the window for a moment before leading her to the stairs, and they went up together into the empty space of the 4th floor, which caught the morning light differently from up here. Wider, higher, the street below, and the city opening out around it, the lake visible in the far east distance between buildings, enormous and gray and still there. She stood at the 4th floor window and looked at the city. She'd spent 11 years standing outside of things. Outside the operating room, outside the life she'd built, outside the version of herself she'd had to close in a box under her bed and tell herself was finished. She'd gotten very good at the position, the distance, the discipline of watching from the edges, the particular talent she'd developed for making herself small enough to fit into spaces that weren't built for her. She was done with that position. She didn't say this. It wasn't the kind of thing you said. It was the kind of thing that had simply become true over 14 days of tunnels and rooftops and warehouse floors, and a man who had looked at her across a crowded bar and seen something she'd stopped believing was visible. I'm going to call it the Brooks Center, she said. Beside her, Tae-hyun was quiet for a moment. Your name. My name. She didn't look at him. The city out the window, gray and enormous and indifferent in the way that had always been its honesty rather than its flaw. Nobody's putting my name on anything and then taking it back. A silence. Then, no. His voice and what was in it, which was considerable. They're not. She looked at the city. She thought about Evelyn in federal custody and the 9 weeks of preparation and the framework built for a nameless person, whoever Tae-hyun would look at, whoever he would see. She thought about being the person he'd seen and what it had cost and what it had given back. She thought about the bar and the card and the drawer she'd put it in instead of the trash. She thought about the small decisions that had seemed, each of them, like nothing. You should have the cut looked at by someone with credentials, she said. The suture line. You're about to have credentials. In 18 months. She looked at him. In the meantime, it should be checked by someone licensed. He looked at her. The thing in his face that had been present since the bar, and choosing to show itself in increments, was present fully now, in the 4th floor light, not managed and not arranged and not performing any version of itself. 18 months, he said. Give or take. I'll wait, he said, and it wasn't only about the suture. She looked at him for a long moment, the city behind her and the empty building around them, and the morning light doing what morning light does. Indiscriminate, honest, landing on everything equally. Then she turned back to the window and looked at Chicago. The lake at the far edge of the city, still there, enormous and cold and completely indifferent, which was its integrity. The cranes at the port facilities. The medical district 3 blocks south. The building around her with its good bones and its right infrastructure and its waiting floors. Her name on a wall that nobody was going to take back. The bus went up Madison Street again. Or maybe it was a different bus. The city didn't pause to clarify. It just moved, the way it always had, forward and grinding and full of people deciding every day who they were going to be next. She had decided. She was still standing at the window when the first snow of the season came down, slow and deliberate, the way the first snow always came in Chicago, like it had been considering this for a while and had finally made up its mind. She watched it cover the street below. She did not move away from the window.